Hello, my name is Professor Ian Robson. I'm a Professor of Strategic Management at the University of Dundee School of Business. I've recently been made a Professor at the school, and it's an absolute privilege to be rejoining this university from Aberdeen University, where I spent 3.5 years in an executive role at the School of Business there. For me, Dundee is an exciting university. It's cutting edge and it really wants to make a difference to its stakeholder groups. And it's just wonderful to be part of the community here as we grow a new school and develop wonderful research and wonderful teaching for our communities. I want to talk to you today about my research, which has been developing over the last 25 years, from when I first started out as a young, early career researcher. And I can tell you that my grandfather was a miner. He worked down the pits of Northumberland, and he would be amazed to see me stand here today, and I'm really proud to be in this role, talking to you about my research. Essentially, about 25, 30 years ago, I started to get interested in social responsibility and issues around ethics and moral philosophy, and it was mostly because at that time, there were many, many high-profile cases that did draw you into that sort of context of practice. And it was things like the Exxon Valdez. You'll remember the Exxon Valdez, the amazing and still record-breaking for the wrong reasons oil spill that occurred off the coast of Alaska due to a run-aground enormous super oil tanker, and some of the mistakes and the errors that were made by the ship's captain and the crew that led to that disaster, but many other things. Nestle's infant formula case in Africa, Lockheed's bribery case in California, the E. coli 157 outbreak in the 80s and 90s that continues to be a problem sometimes today, the salmonella outbreak, mad cow disease, the logging of hardwoods in South America, the dumping of banned pesticides in developing countries by some of the global pharmaceutical and chemical companies, the tobacco industry and its general problems with health and ethical issues, arms trading, and more recently, of course, fracking, which has been an amazing story over the last 5 years, especially in Scotland, but throughout the UK and Europe and America. It's been an amazing sort of industry to look at. And when you look at these cases, you often see basic human error, corporate problems with policy and practice, with operations, and generally a lack of attention to values and detail in how companies operate, how governments operate, and how really the search for profit and corporate success certainly overrides and trumps the issues of social and environmental responsibility. So starting to look at these cases and trying to take a balanced view, because a lot of these cases involve companies that were trying to do good for people and for the environment and society. So it's not just the case that these companies are populated by evil people who just want to do whatever they can to make money. That's not the case. There's a much more complicated backdrop to some of these cases. And what I wanted to do was to look all the way back to 2,500 years BC, to the world of Plato, Aristotle, and Socrates, to see what the ancient philosophers said about moral behavior, moral good. And I read things like Plato's The Ship of State, which is an incredible allegory. It looks at how people with vision are often ignored, people with insight are ignored in organisational settings because of politics, because of infighting, because of greed, for all sorts of other reasons. People who have a good sense of what's right tend to be ignored. And then I worked my way through the philosophers to Aristotle and his ideas about people who should be searching for the good life, living the good life, making easy decisions, good decisions, right decisions. And his view of rhetoric as well as both a positive and a dangerous element of human behaviour, the fact that we use conversational rhetoric to persuade and to perhaps subjectify or make subjective things that you want to take place or want to happen. So my initial look at these cases was through those kinds of lenses. It was looking at these problems, these catastrophes, these emerging issues with health and the environment and society, using the ideas of Aristotle in particular to try and make some sense of what was going on. Getting to the root cause of those scandals, I started to see that supermarkets had a coercive power. There were very few, and even now even fewer now, supermarkets who dominate a huge proportion of our food consumption in the UK. At that time it was the big five, now it's down to the big three. And that means that there are a lot of operational policies that these supermarkets implement that are sensible. You know, you can see the rationality. They're trying to control costs. They're trying to control quality. They're trying to adhere to, well, as it was, European standards and health and safety standards across the UK. So that they were deliberately looking to control the supply chain in the food industry. But in doing so, they were fixing concepts of quality. They were fixing prices. They were determining and dictating the prices and therefore the costs of every level of the food supply chain in the UK and beyond. You know, their reach is very, very long, very far. So things like open book costings, dominating logistics, dominating distribution centres, and telling food production companies, food processing companies, the agricultural industry, what they could charge for their goods. So it was far from a free market. It was very controlled. And those costs that were laid at the door of all of these companies, farms, farmers, food processing companies, packaging companies, logistics companies, animal husbandry companies, all of these companies were subject to inspection costs, quality assurance costs, and they were dictated to by the supermarkets and by the regulatory bodies. So I'm not suggesting for a minute there was a deliberate coercion, but that's how the system was developing and still is today. So it did lead to improved quality standards, lower costs of many, many foods, but also paradoxically, because of the European Community rules, the import of inferior food products, inferior standards in other countries were allowed to take place by their regulatory systems. So the UK food supply chain felt that it was unfair, it was unjust, and that they were actually bearing the costs of all of these, you know, media-fueled food scandals. But nevertheless, the decision makers themselves were the focus of my research. And when you look at them, when you look at managers, leaders, people who make decisions in these companies, you find a number of sort of problems or conflicts or situations that are difficult for these people. The first is role conflict. And with these managers and leaders, the values, the ethical standards that they have in their private life does not translate necessarily into their professional life. And that's one really interesting idea, that, you know, you'd bribe your child, you'd offer them sweets or chocolate to ask them to behave well. But if you did that in a work context, that would be illegal. Bribery is not a legal activity. So, you know, that's an extreme case, but you start to see how, you know, our values are very different depending on the roles that we have. In these companies, there was a distinct lack of transparency. Everything was quite guarded and hidden, and many things were hidden for a reason. Recipes are very important in the food industry, and they're seen as part of the IP and brand value of a company. Whistleblowing was not acceptable. Whistleblowing was not encouraged. And there was a hierarchy of purpose in these roles. The people who make the decisions often have to place the success and performance of the company above their own values, above their own role. So there is always this conflict and tension in decision making in these companies. Another thing that I found was, using moral philosophy, the idea that ought equals can is important. We often say that people ought to behave in this way, ought to make decisions in this way, but sometimes people can't. They have no scope or space or power to behave in the way that society would like them to behave. So there are other ways of looking at what goes on in business and what happens in this instance in the food industry. And that leadership has an incredible impact on people. I mean, leadership's quite a subjective, difficult concept generally to pin down. It's difficult to see the precise attribution, the real impact of a leader on a group of people. But in many cases, you do know that a good leader is someone that you want to work for, you want to work harder for, and that you want to please. So leadership is really influential and important. And there's a lot of toxicity in companies, especially where the products or services are sensitive or are dangerous or are certainly politically sensitive or media sensitive. So there are a lot of toxic environments that we work in and live in that are at least in major part down to the style and values of the leaders who are involved in creating the culture, creating the company, driving the business forward. And then there's rhetoric and reality, that a lot of things that people say are nothing to do with reality. People say things, especially when they're defending an ethical position or explaining the reasons behind a decision, that are just about persuasion. They're missing a lot of facts, missing objectivity, but using impassioned pleas, emotive reasoning to persuade you that what they're doing is the right thing. And I found a lot of that, and of course that links us back to Aristotle. And the difference between rhetoric and reality is stark in many industries. And of course, today my research has taken on a different angle because of fracking, essentially. A really interesting, highly sensitive bit of industrial development, and it links very much with large infrastructure projects. So highways, bridges, out of town shopping developments, housing developments, all sorts of structural developments in the economy carry a similar kind of sensitivity as fracking, because they impact significantly on the environment and on people. And so my research has looked at this gap, this rupture between society and operators, contractors, government agencies, government departments. And what you find is these days that social media is a real driving force to mobilize social action. And there are often a lot of agencies around civil organizations, civil service organizations that are there to mobilize public opinion, to support groups, affected communities, groups of communities who feel they have no voice, who feel they're not being listened to. And really society has the right to decide on a lot of these projects. And they need the right information, they need hard data, they need the right knowledge to be able to make better decisions or to form their opinions. And some of these pressure groups are really helpful in doing that sort of job. But it ends up with rupture. There's often this escalation of behavior that drives a wedge between a company and an affected community in these projects. Another word that I want to introduce is this phrase, rather, social license to operate. And that's become a very important concept. And we don't know how we achieve it. We know that we want it. It's difficult to measure, difficult to know when you've got it and when you haven't got it. But it's a general concept that companies and organizations these days are aiming towards. They want the support of society. And this is a game changer, because their rhetoric isn't enough. They can't persuade through misleading people, and they can't continue with what I call asymmetric communication. They talk in jargonistic terms. They use scientific language. So the fracking people would talk about seismic activity, and most people don't know what that means. If you elicit a seismic response to drilling into the ground, what does that mean? And then we get asymmetric communication that's negative the other way. The general public, me included, think that that's an earthquake. So there's a lot of education and gentle, slow work needed to understand each other in these kinds of conflicts and ruptures. And then it's interesting to look at the political figures, how they decouple from some projects and walk away, and how they support companies and then hang them out to dry when society rails against the project. So to finish off then, coming back to Aristotle, where I started, what would Aristotle say about today's business, today's leadership, today's politicians? What he wanted to see. He wanted to see leaders and decision makers make decisions without inner turmoil. And what I've described to you is the very opposite of that. It's a conflictual, dynamic world where information is skewed, where persuasion is used, and where hard data and the facts are hard to come by. And we all want to make fast decisions. So it's a difficult context for decision making, and we give that to the decision makers, of course, but these decision makers are not operating smoothly without inner turmoil because they're conflicted, because they have different values at home and at work, and it's difficult to put those things together. Are they seeking the good life? Are they making ethically positive decisions? Sometimes yes, sometimes no. Can they rise above economic and financial matters to do the right thing? Well, that's a tricky one. Ought equals can, remember. So it's difficult to expect some decision makers to place society and the environment above finance and the economy, although we want them to. And the long term says that we should do. And societies become much more demanding as information becomes easier to access. So society is much more inquisitive, much more inquiring, much more critical, and far more mobile in its response to these kinds of projects. And social license, I think, is difficult to achieve and sustain, but it has to be more than just words. It has to be systematized, embedded in the culture of companies and society, and it has to be something that we genuinely seek to achieve. Companies have to be able to say, no, we don't want to proceed with this project. They have to listen, they have to take their time, and they have to be slow and fast thinkers to enable good decisions to be made. And as far as I'm concerned, I think Aristotle would be scathing of our leaders today. And that ends my talk. All I can say is that for a School of Business, this is a big challenge, and that what we're doing in Dundee is working really hard to develop responsible, innovative, thoughtful leaders for our future. Thank you very much for listening.